In the early spring of 1944, on the vast plains of the Eastern Front, a thin German defensive line faced one of the largest Soviet armored thrusts of the war. The Red Army, seeking to exploit its momentum after the Dnieper crossings, deployed more than 200 tanks supported by artillery and mechanized infantry. Their objective was simple: to break through the German position near Kovel and drive west before the Wehrmacht could regroup. The defenders were not elite troops or remnants of the old panzer divisions. They were a composite force: mechanics, artillery crews, infantry from decimated battalions, and remnants of a reconnaissance regiment, all thrown together under an exhausted command structure. Their fortifications were minimal: shallow trenches, a few anti-tank ditches, and hastily placed mines. Ammunition was limited and fuel nearly gone. What the Soviets did not expect was how organized desperation could function under extreme pressure. The German command system had, by 1944, evolved into a network of semi-independent Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups capable of holding ground far beyond their numbers. These groups, often formed overnight, operated with flexible tactics designed to delay, not to destroy. The defense near Kovel was not planned as a grand stand. It began as a delaying action meant to buy time for withdrawal. Yet as Soviet armored columns rolled forward, the situation transformed into one of those rare military phenomena where terrain, improvisation, and sheer determination converge. Commanders along the line realized that retreating meant collapse. Orders changed from hold until nightfall to hold at all costs. The terrain itself favored the defenders. The spring thaw had turned the lowlands into fields of mud and standing water. Soviet armor struggled to maneuver, funneling into narrow tracks that exposed flanks to German guns. Panzerfausts, 75mm pack guns, and even captured Soviet 45mm cannons were placed at angles calculated not for open field duels, but for short, brutal ambushes. By dawn on March 25th, Soviet reconnaissance units reported unexpectedly strong resistance. Radio intercepts from their side recorded confusion. The German positions, expected to collapse in hours, were coordinating artillery and counterattacks with precision that suggested a much larger force. What followed over the next 72 hours became one of the most improbable defensive actions on the Eastern Front, not because it changed the course of the war, but because it demonstrated how, even in near-total exhaustion, a coherent defensive doctrine could hold back overwhelming mechanized power. As the morning fog lifted, Soviet T-34s advanced in columns, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze. The initial artillery barrage had churned the earth into smoking craters, but inflicted little real damage on the defenders. The German lines, though thin, were arranged in a web of overlapping fields of fire. Machine guns, anti-tank guns, and mortars coordinated through preset radio frequencies, an innovation forced by necessity rather than planning. The defensive commander, operating from a dugout connected by field telephone to the scattered units, relied on speed of communication instead of sheer manpower. When Soviet armor breached one sector, artillery from another opened fire within minutes. The battle resembled a network reacting instinctively, each section protecting the next. This system of elastic defense had been refined since 1943, allowing outnumbered units to stretch the enemy's advance while preserving their core strength. The Soviets, expecting a disorganized retreat, found themselves trapped in a cycle of local counterattacks. Every tank that pushed too far was hit from three sides. Mines crippled tracks. Close-range Panzerfausts finished the rest. Soviet infantry, advancing without armored cover, was forced to crawl through mud and debris under constant mortar fire. By midday, smoke obscured the entire sector. Reports from the Soviet 11th Tank Corps noted a delaying action of unusual intensity. Radio operators intercepted German transmissions referencing ammunition shortages and repeated calls for resupply that never came. Yet the defense held. The German logistics had nearly collapsed. Trucks could not reach the front through the swampy roads, and horse carts sank into the mud. Ammunition was redistributed by hand, men carrying crates through ditches, crawling under fire. Every shell mattered. Gun crews learned to fire only when certain of a hit. Wasted rounds meant silence later in the day. Still, the defensive structure endured because of its communication discipline. The Germans had implemented a principle borrowed from mobile warfare: decentralized decision-making. Squad leaders had authority to reposition or withdraw without direct orders. This flexibility meant that when Soviet tanks broke through the first trench line, they often found themselves facing regrouped defenders a few hundred meters deeper, already ready to strike. By nightfall, the Soviets had advanced barely 2 kilometers. The promised one-hour breakthrough turned into a grinding attrition fight. German field radios, overheard by Soviet interceptors, repeated one phrase again and again: position holding, continue fire. In purely strategic terms, the defense was insignificant, but tactically, it revealed how even a disintegrating army could generate temporary superiority through cohesion and control of tempo. The battlefield around Kovel was no longer defined by numbers. It was defined by reaction speed and the will to exploit every terrain feature. By dawn on March 26th, the Soviets committed their reserves. 2 full tank brigades and self-propelled artillery units were ordered to crush what was assumed to be a pocket of resistance. The plan called for a double envelopment: one column pushing along the road toward Kovel, another sweeping north through the marshes to cut off retreat. Yet neither group realized how effectively the defenders had mapped the terrain. The German positions were arranged not in a straight line, but in a staggered defense in depth. Every layer was designed to slow the enemy with maximum efficiency and minimum expenditure. When the first Soviet wave encountered resistance, the second wave inevitably drove into the same kill zones, areas already pre-sighted by German gunners. Soviet tank commanders complained that the battlefield seemed alive because each turn brought hidden fire from unexpected directions. The defenders used wrecks as part of their strategy. Destroyed T-34s were left in place to funnel later attackers. In some sectors, German engineers mined the gaps between burned-out tanks, transforming the battlefield into a lethal labyrinth. Even the terrain itself fought for them. Deep mud trapped heavy vehicles, while smoke from burning armor obscured visibility and disoriented tank crews. Aerial reconnaissance proved unreliable. Soviet spotter planes reported minimal resistance, not realizing the Germans had withdrawn most heavy guns into tree lines and concealed hollows. Each time Soviet tanks pushed forward, a hidden PaK-40 opened fire at short range. The result was a battle fought in flashes, momentary explosions followed by silence. Inside German lines, exhaustion set in. Soldiers had been awake for nearly 40 hours. Field medics used captured Soviet morphine and improvised bandages from torn uniforms. Still, morale held. Units that had begun the battle as fragments of different regiments now functioned as a single coherent organism. The shared understanding that withdrawal meant annihilation forged a level of unity rarely achieved through command. On the Soviet side, confusion deepened. Radio contact between advancing tank groups broke down due to terrain and interference. Commanders, believing success was near, pushed forward without coordination. The result was chaos. Individual platoons advancing into ambushes, artillery firing blind into smoke, and infantry unable to distinguish friend from foe. By late afternoon, the German commander issued a brief message to headquarters: enemy movement slowing. Counterattack possible on limited front. It was not bravado, it was calculation. The Soviets had lost cohesion, and the moment to strike back had come. As twilight settled over the flooded fields, the defenders began a counterattack so limited and improvised that Soviet intelligence at first refused to believe it had occurred. The order was simple: regain the high ground overlooking the road junction, an insignificant patch of elevation that, in the flat terrain, offered visibility for artillery spotting. Without that ridge, the Germans would lose their ability to direct fire effectively. A reserve of barely 100 men, including signals operators and cooks, was assembled. Their weapons were mismatched: captured PPSH submachine guns, a few machine pistols, and 2 working anti-tank guns pulled forward by hand. The ground was so waterlogged that even light vehicles could not move. The counterattack began in near silence, under cover of burning wrecks that still illuminated the horizon with an orange glow. What made the move possible was timing. Soviet tank crews had stopped for refueling and reorganization, assuming the Germans were finished. When the small German assault team struck, they hit the exposed flanks of refueling columns and supply trucks. Ammunition carts detonated, causing confusion far beyond the actual scope of the attack. Within minutes, Soviet communications in that sector went down completely. Artillery observers used the brief window to correct their fire. German 105mm howitzers, operating miles behind the lines, began pounding the road junction with precision. Each shell landed on coordinates transmitted by runners, since radio signals were jammed. The ridge, barely held by a handful of men, became the nerve center of the entire defense. Soviet counterfire arrived quickly but inaccurately. The Red Army's doctrine emphasized momentum over coordination. Artillery often fired based on old map data, unaware that German units had shifted position. Shells exploded hundreds of meters off target, showering mud over the defenders, but causing little damage. By midnight, the German counterattack had ended, not through defeat, but exhaustion. Half the men were wounded or missing, but they held the ridge. The immediate Soviet advance had been halted for the first time in 36 hours. The German command recorded it as a local success, yet its psychological impact was far greater. Word spread through the trenches that the impossible line had held again. Even soldiers without ammunition continued manning positions with captured weapons. The concept of a hopeless defense had transformed into a structured resistance. At dawn, reconnaissance confirmed what few had believed possible. The Soviet spearhead had stalled. Over 200 tanks had been committed to the offensive. Nearly one-third were now destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned in the mud. The battlefield near Kovel had become a graveyard of metal and willpower, a place where a fragmented army, on the edge of collapse, had managed to dictate the rhythm of war for one more day. The battle entered its third day with neither side able to claim victory. The Soviet command, frustrated by the lack of progress, replaced local officers and ordered a renewed assault at any cost. For them, delay was defeat. Each hour allowed the Germans to strengthen the line and bring in scattered reinforcements from neighboring sectors. For the defenders, time was survival itself. The German defensive method that evolved on this battlefield was not the product of genius, but of exhaustion. It reflected a doctrine shaped by years of retreat, Verzögerungskrieg, the war of delay. Its principles were brutally simple: trade space for time, make the enemy pay for every meter, and never allow a continuous front to become a single point of failure. Commanders were expected to make independent decisions based on local conditions, and by 1944, that autonomy had become the only reason units could still function. Around Kovel, this doctrine reached its extreme form. There was no grand strategy, only sequences of reactions. When Soviet tanks advanced, defenders withdrew a few hundred meters, waited for the enemy to thin out, and then struck the isolated elements. Each retreat was tactical, not chaotic. Maps captured later by the Soviets showed a spiderweb of fallback positions, all interconnected by trenches and marked for overlapping artillery fire. The Soviets had superior numbers, but their coordination faltered against an enemy that refused to stand still. Frontal assaults met empty positions. Counterattacks hit exposed flanks. Tanks that reached open ground often found themselves encircled by infantry armed with magnetic mines and flamethrowers. The result was a paradoxical battlefield where motion favored the weaker side. Meanwhile, supply continued to deteriorate. Ammunition stockpiles were nearly gone. Field kitchens had ceased to function, and soldiers ate dry bread mixed with melted snow. Yet discipline held. The Wehrmacht's bureaucratic precision, often criticized as rigid, proved its greatest strength. Even in collapse, records were kept, shells were counted, and radio protocols followed. This allowed each Kampfgruppe to operate as a functioning cell within a broken organism. For Soviet tank crews, the psychological effect was severe. They reported firing at targets that disappeared into the earth, unable to distinguish destroyed positions from hidden ones. Some began to believe they faced elite panzer troops, though in truth, most defenders were ordinary infantrymen led by reserve officers. By the end of the third day, the Soviet Offensive Command recorded the advance as unsatisfactory. The High Command demanded explanations, unaware that a depleted German force of fewer than 3,000 men had delayed a mechanized corps for 72 hours. The hopeless defense had become a demonstration, proof that, under the right conditions, doctrine and discipline could momentarily outweigh numbers and firepower. The price was horrific, but the line still stood. On the morning of March 27, the battlefield was silent for the first time in days. Smoke hung over the lowlands and the air smelled of oil and burned metal. Both armies paused, not by agreement, but exhaustion. The Soviets used the lull to recover disabled vehicles and reorganize shattered formations. The Germans used it to count what remained. Fewer than half of the original defenders were still combat effective. The field hospitals, if they could be called that, were trenches lined with straw and morphine shortages. Still, orders came from higher command. Hold Kovel at any cost. The directive, issued from hundreds of kilometers away, had little meaning to the men on the ground. They were not defending a city or strategic node. They were defending the logic of resistance itself. The line, if lost, would open the path westward and expose the entire flank of the retreating army group. At midday, Soviet reconnaissance detected minimal movement in the German positions. Believing the defense was collapsing, they prepared one more decisive strike. Yet this time, the attack unfolded differently. The Red Army advanced cautiously, wary of hidden guns and minefields. Their artillery began a measured bombardment instead of a single, overwhelming barrage, attempting to suppress known defensive zones before moving forward. Inside the German lines, radio discipline and tactical doctrine again made the difference. Artillery observers had memorized range tables and firing solutions after days of repetition. Without functioning telephones, runners carried firing coordinates scratched onto bits of metal and cloth. The remaining guns, some manned by crews of only two, fired with mathematical precision. The Soviets expected a rapid collapse but met a new pattern of defense, the fire pocket. Each German strongpoint was ordered to hold fire until the enemy entered a pre-sighted grid, then unleash all remaining ammunition at once. The effect was devastating. Soviet tank crews, lulled by hours of quiet, drove into concentrated bursts of anti-tank fire that destroyed entire platoons in seconds. By afternoon, the Red Army had achieved local penetrations, but no breakthrough. Reports described unexpected intensity of fire from diminished enemy units. German after-action notes later revealed that some positions had only a single gun, moved repeatedly between craters to simulate multiple batteries. It was deception on the smallest scale, but multiplied across the front, it created the illusion of an army still intact. When night fell, both sides remained where they had started. The Soviets claimed progress in communiques. The Germans claimed steadfast defense. Neither report matched reality. The front was dissolving into chaos, but the cohesion of the German system, the habits of procedure, timing, and discipline, allowed fragments to function as a whole. Even as ammunition dwindled and communications broke, the defenders maintained the one advantage that the Soviets could not quantify: predictability of action. Every German soldier, down to the last man, knew what to do if his unit ceased to exist. By March 28th, the battle for Kovel had devolved into an illusion, the image of strength masking a reality of exhaustion. The Soviet command, interpreting German persistence as reinforcement, redirected air power and additional tank brigades into the sector. In truth, there were no reinforcements. The same depleted units, short of food and ammunition, now faced airstrikes without the protection of anti-aircraft cover. Each German battery had fewer than a dozen shells. The men rationed fire with mechanical discipline, reserving the last rounds for tanks within sight. Infantry rotated positions to simulate a larger force. Radios that no longer transmitted were left running static to create the impression of constant communication. Even silence became a tool of deception. The Soviets increased pressure from dawn to dusk. Yak fighters strafed the trenches. Katyusha rockets pounded the rear areas. Yet despite the barrage, Soviet tank commanders hesitated to advance. Reports of hidden guns and ambushes circulated through the ranks, creating a psychological paralysis. Crews began firing at shadows, at tree lines, wrecks, and phantom enemies. What sustained the defenders was the mechanical rhythm of the German system. Orders came through even when entire companies ceased to exist. Replacement officers stepped into command instantly, following standardized procedures written months earlier. This was not heroism in the romantic sense. It was the outcome of a culture that prized structure above individuality. In chaos, that structure became the last form of survival. By midday, a shift occurred. The Soviets began to pull back portions of their armor, not from defeat but to regroup for a new offensive elsewhere. Intelligence suggested that the German line, though stubborn, was no longer capable of organized maneuver. Strategically, the Red Army had achieved its goal. The defenders could no longer retreat, only resist. Inside the German perimeter, that resistance continued as ritual. Guns were cleaned, though no ammunition remained. Reports were filed, though there was nothing left to report. The battle had transformed from a tactical engagement into an act of endurance, a demonstration of order maintained against entropy. At dusk, an observer from the remnants of a Luftwaffe liaison unit recorded a simple note in his log. The front appears intact, though there is nothing behind it. The illusion had become complete. Soviet reconnaissance, seeing no visible collapse, reported the German positions as well fortified. The reality was that most trenches were empty, held by a handful of men pretending to be a regiment. The hopeless defense had achieved its paradox. By projecting strength it did not possess, it held back forces that should have overwhelmed it. The morning of March 29th arrived under heavy mist and artillery thunder. The Soviet command, determined to finish what had begun 5 days earlier, launched its largest coordinated assault of the engagement. Nearly the entire front erupted simultaneously, tanks advancing in lines, infantry following under rolling barrages, spotter planes circling overhead. It was no longer a test of tactics, it was a test of endurance. The German defense, already hollow, cracked in several places. Communication lines were cut, forward observers killed, and several gun positions overrun before they could fire a shot. Those still standing operated independently, shifting fire by instinct rather than command. Each position had become an island of resistance, surrounded but still functioning. In one sector, Soviet armor broke through a trench line and reached the artillery park behind it. Gun crews, out of shells, fired smoke rounds and signal flares to blind the attackers. Others detonated their own ammunition to block the advance. What should have been a rout turned into chaos. Columns of T-34s halted among flames and debris, unsure of the scale of resistance ahead. German coordination now relied entirely on habit. Men who had fought together for weeks responded to each other's movements without words. When one gun fell silent, another shifted angle to cover its sector. When an infantry platoon was lost, its neighboring unit absorbed survivors automatically. The doctrine of decentralized command had reached its final evolution, spontaneous coherence born from discipline. Yet the cost was total exhaustion. Medical units were gone, food was gone, and even the wounded refused evacuation because there was nowhere to go. Field radios transmitted broken phrases between bursts of static. Every request for ammunition ended with the same response: none available. By noon, Soviet commanders reported visible German withdrawal. In truth, it was a collapse masked by procedure. Units retreated in segments, leaving rear guards to delay pursuit. Even as the front disintegrated, those rear guards continued to report positions and fire directions as though the battle still had meaning. At 1400 hours, the first Soviet tanks reached the command dugout. The defenders destroyed their documents and radio equipment before retreating into the forest. The line that had held for nearly a week finally ceased to exist as a continuous front. But the Soviet advance was too slow to exploit the breakthrough. Their columns bogged down in mud and wreckage, the remnants of their own assault littering the field. What should have been a clean victory became another day of dragging vehicles and burned supply trucks. When the smoke cleared, the map had changed little. The Germans had fallen back several kilometers, yet the Soviet timetable had collapsed. What was planned as a 3-hour operation had consumed nearly a week. The hopeless defense had not won, but it had achieved the only victory still possible: time. By the end of March, the battle for Kovel faded into the wider chaos of the Eastern Front. Reports on both sides reduced it to a footnote: local resistance encountered, enemy positions neutralized. Yet for those who survived, the landscape was unrecognizable. The fields were cratered beyond repair, dotted with the wrecks of over 200 tanks and self-propelled guns. The air reeked of fuel and cordite. No trees remained standing for kilometers. German High Command declared the defense a temporary success and used it in internal briefings as proof that discipline could hold the line against overwhelming force. In reality, the defenders had been annihilated as a fighting formation. Only fragments retreated toward the west, merging with other retreating units. The cost was enormous, but so too was the delay inflicted on the Red Army's timetable. The Kovel sector, expected to fall in 2 days, held for nearly a week. For the Soviets, the engagement was recorded as an operational victory, but it carried uncomfortable lessons. Commanders noted that superior numbers could fail when met with coordinated small unit tactics and terrain exploitation. Their reports recommended new countermeasures, closer air-ground coordination, improved reconnaissance, and better logistical preparation for spring conditions. In later offensives, these lessons would prove decisive. The battle also illustrated the changing nature of war in 1944. Gone were the sweeping offensives of earlier years. In their place stood grinding confrontations defined by logistics, weather, and exhaustion. The German army no longer possessed strategic mobility, but it retained an administrative precision that allowed it to resist long after its tactical edge was gone. For historians, the defense of Kovel exemplifies the paradox of late-war German operations. Tactical brilliance serving strategic futility. Each successful delay bought hours at the cost of irreplaceable men and material, extending a war that could no longer be won. The local victories, however courageous, became mechanisms of national ruin. In Soviet archives, the engagement is cited for another reason. It demonstrated how resistance born of desperation could distort perception. For days, Soviet units overestimated the enemy's strength by a factor of 10. The Germans, with only a few working guns, projected the power of an entire corps. It was a reminder that war was not just about numbers, but about information, and how easily that information could deceive both sides. When the front finally stabilized, snow fell again over the shattered ground. The line of defense that had once existed vanished beneath mud and ice, leaving only scattered helmets, wrecks, and unmarked graves. The hopeless defense had delayed history, but could not alter its direction. In the weeks that followed, Kovel ceased to exist as a distinct battlefield. New offensives rolled over it, erasing the traces of the engagement beneath layers of fresh destruction. For both sides, it became another coordinate on a map, absorbed into a war that had grown too vast for memory. Yet within military circles, the defense was studied, quietly without sentiment, as a model of what a disciplined army could still achieve under collapse. German officers described it as eine Verteidigung ohne Hoffnung, a defense without hope. They recognized that success no longer meant victory, but endurance. Orders and procedures, once tools of conquest, had become instruments of survival. That transformation defined the late Wehrmacht, an institution still capable of organization even as its strategic foundation disintegrated. For the Red Army, the encounter hardened doctrine. The lessons learned at Kovel reappeared months later in Operation Bagration. Soviet planners emphasized speed, coordination, and logistical depth, precisely the weaknesses exposed by the stubborn German stand. When the Great Summer Offensives began, those reforms turned local setbacks into overwhelming victories. The system had adapted. On the ground, nothing remained. The forest where the final positions had stood were stripped bare. Farmers returning years later unearthed fragments of steel and bone, relics of a battle no one officially remembered. The men who fought there, on both sides, left almost no written testimony. Their endurance existed only in the reports of others. A few lines of data, a notation in a staff summary, a mention of heavy resistance encountered. Yet within those lines lay the essence of the event. It was not a story of heroism or ideology, but of process, how an army could continue to function when stripped of purpose, how discipline became its own form of identity. In that sense, the defense near Kovel was more than an episode of the war. It was a reflection of the 20th century's industrialized warfare, where systems outlasted men and the machinery of command persisted long after meaning had vanished. Historians later compared it to the doomed defenses of ancient armies, Thermopylae, Masada, but the analogy misses the truth. Those were battles of defiance. Kovel was a battle of inertia. It demonstrated that even in total futility, structure could delay destruction. When the front moved west and spring returned, the mud dried, the wrecks rusted, and the war continued without pause. The names of the villages were replaced on maps. The soldiers were replaced in ranks. Nothing about the defense changed the outcome. But for 7 days amid exhaustion, chaos, and certainty of defeat, a broken line held its shape, and in doing so revealed how order itself can become a final act of resistance. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.